Professor Visser, il suo ultimo libro comincia con un'affermazione molto forte. La corporate social responsibility è stato un fallimento. E cosa intende dire con questa affermazione?
Well, what do I mean when I say that CSR has failed? One way to think about it is that a doctor judges his or her success by whether the patient gets better or more sick. In the same way, companies or business should be judging the success of their CSR by whether the society and the environment are getting better or worse. And unfortunately, on virtually every indicator we have, the case is that the trends are heading in the wrong direction. Whether we look at corruption, whether we look at biodiversity loss, whether we look at the gap between rich and poor, whether we look at resource loss, all of these indicators tell us that everything that we've been doing over the last 20 to 50 years in CSR has made virtually no difference, and in fact things have been getting worse rather than better. And there's a very good reason for that. The reason is that we haven't changed the economic system. So the shareholder-driven capitalism that we have is driving an economic model which at its heart is unsustainable. And it's unsustainable in the way that we see emerging companies going from having low human development to high human development, but in the process they completely move beyond the capacity of the planet. So that if they reach the level of the United States, we would in fact need 4.5 planets to sustain us. And so it's failing really for 3 reasons. The first is that the approach has been incremental, by which I mean slow, stepwise change. This is the typical approach of continuous improvement through the ISO standards like ISO 9000, ISO 14000. And the problem is that although it creates continuous improvement, the scale and the urgency of the problems is much bigger than the solutions that we're achieving through that incremental approach. The second reason is that it's peripheral. This is a failing in that it sits on the side. It's in an HR department or it's in a corporate affairs department. It's never really integrated into the business. Also, CSR is peripheral in the sense that it tends to only affect the big companies. But what about the tens of thousands or even millions of small and medium-sized enterprises? They have collectively a much bigger impact, and they also need to be doing a more socially responsible approach to business. The third and final reason why it's failing is that it tends to be uneconomic, by which I mean that the market consistently rewards unsustainable and irresponsible practices. If you take as an example the Vice Fund, this is a fund in the United States which only invests in the so-called sin industries. That's tobacco, alcohol, gambling, and military equipment. It completely outperforms the market. So at the moment the message is still, if you want to make money, you can do so and be very well rewarded by the market by being irresponsible and unsustainable. And we need to change that so that every action we take in business we get rewarded for if it's for the common good, and we get penalized, genuinely penalized, if it's eroding the common good. So in that sense, I believe we're failing, and we'll continue to fail even if we have more CSR, unless we have a different type of CSR. And this is what I'm calling CSR 2.0.
Nel suo libro lei suggerisce che dobbiamo entrare, le imprese devono entrare in una nuova età, l'età che lei chiama l'età della responsabilità, e che per questo c'è bisogno di un nuovo DNA nelle imprese, che lei definisce la Corporate Social Responsibility 2.0. E cosa c'è in questo 2.0?
Well, the idea of CSR 2.0 draws inspiration from the change that we saw with the internet, from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. It's a metaphor, an analogy. And so what did we notice when the internet began transforming? Well, Web 1.0, if you recall, was very much a platform where companies would put their advertising brochures online. It was one-way communication. It hadn't gone to scale. It was about 45 million users in 1996. And in the same way, even though there were innovators like Netscape, companies like Microsoft got involved and standardized all the hardware and software. And if we look at what's happened with corporate social responsibility, it's very similar. A lot of it has been about one-way communication, about companies telling the world how wonderful they are and all the social responsible activities that they're performing. There have been some innovators. If we think of companies like The Body Shop or the Ethical Trading Initiative, but what's happened more recently is the big companies like Walmart have got involved and the whole approach has been standardized. To the extent, in fact, that in one of my books, The A to Z of Corporate Social Responsibility, we profiled over 100 CSR codes and standards. So everything has been uniformly standardized. And of course, it hasn't gone to scale. It's mainly sitting with those large companies in side departments, CSR departments, or HR departments. Now, what changed when the web went to Web 2.0, of course, was first it went to scale, so 1 billion users by 2006. Not only that, but it became far more interactive, about two-way communication. We heard about things like collective intelligence, Wikipedia, user-generated content through blogs and tweets. And in the same way, CSR 2.0 is really about changing that approach so that it becomes far less about just telling society how responsible you are and far more about listening to the genuine needs of your stakeholders and responding and co-creating the solutions that we need. And of course going to scale. So we need more of what we call the Walmart effect, where actually sustainable products and services become the standard, the mainstream in the market, rather than the exception. So what do we mean by CSR 2.0? There are 5 principles that underlie this concept. The first is creativity, by which we mean innovation. We need to use our social innovation to create products and services that genuinely solve the problems of the world. So take Vodafone with their M-Pesa technology in Kenya that allows people who didn't have bank accounts to transfer money by text. This is using the creativity of the company and the technology to solve a social problem. The second principle is scalability. This is the example of Walmart saying that all their fish products will be Marine Stewardship Council certified. All of their cotton products will be organic. This is something we call choice editing. So no longer offering niche products and services that are ethical, but actually making ethical products the new mainstream. The third principle then is responsiveness. So what do we mean by responsiveness? Are we genuinely listening to stakeholders? Are we listening to their needs and responding? Or are we just going on with our economic activity and then accommodating them afterwards? The fourth principle is glocality. This is the idea of think global, act local. So are we both concerned, for example, about climate change at a global level, but also about public health issues, malaria prevention in Mozambique, as was the case with BHP Billiton operating their mines in that part of the world. The last principle is circularity. This is the idea of cradle-to-cradle production, no longer throwing away goods, throwing away waste, but closing the loop of production so that every resource is in an eternal circle, and so that waste in fact becomes zero. And there are companies that are committing to this now, whether it be Interface or Fuji Xerox. They're committing to the goal of zero waste. So by these 5 principles we can test whether the CSR approach is 1.0 or 2.0.
Lei ha svolto recentemente una ricerca esaminando le pratiche in termini di corporate social responsibility che si possono riscontrare in 20 nazioni del mondo. E ci piacerebbe sapere quali insegnamenti fondamentali ne trae e quali differenze in qualche modo ha potuto riscontrare.
Well, as I've traveled around the world and I've visited now more than 50 countries, what I've noticed is that companies tend to be stuck in one of 5 what I call ages and stages of CSR. The first stage is what I call defensive CSR, and that's stuck in an age of greed. And we've seen a lot of evidence of this, whether it's the collapse of Enron in 2001 or the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. Much of the financial crisis we see ourselves in is as a result of an age of greed. And so the interesting thing here is that the companies involved in that do have CSR practices, but they tend to only do enough to keep the legal authorities off their back or to keep their community happy or their employees happy. Meanwhile, the focus is almost exclusively on economic growth and financial profits. The second age and stage that we find companies in is the philanthropic approach to CSR in an age of charity. Now, this is the idea that giving back to the community is a good idea so long as you take a lot more out first. In other words, a company can be tremendously economically successful, and we don't question how they made their money so long as they are very generous about giving their money away at the end. And we really need to question this model now and think about what is the impact of companies while they're making their money and not just how generous are they at the end. The third stage is a promotional approach to CSR. In fact, when we ask CEOs, as the World Economic Forum does every year, why do they do CSR? Their answer is mostly for brand and reputation. So what we can understand by that is that most companies at the moment are using CSR as a marketing tactic. And this is not to say that you shouldn't get the benefit of improved reputation from doing social responsibility. But if you remain stuck in that idea, then you never really make the impact that we need to see in the world today. The fourth stage is strategic CSR in an age of management. And this is what we get when we implement the codes and the standards and the guidelines of which there are so many in the CSR field at the moment. It's the idea of continuous improvement, of quality management, and it's what we see when, for example, Coca-Cola got in trouble in India, in the district of Kerala, where the community accused them of draining the water supply. Coca-Cola realized that water was their strategic CSR issue. It's what their company is dependent on. And so they began investing a huge amount of money in not only improving their own water efficiency, but also the access to water in the community. So that's a strategic approach, and all 4 of those approaches are, I believe, failing to turn around the problems. And so the 5th approach that I've just started to see as I travel the world, I've seen some examples, is the transformative approach to CSR, or what I'm calling CSR 2.0, and that's in an age of responsibility. And that's really about changing the rules of the game so that every action that you take as a company has a positive effect, so that you're not being less bad. In fact, everything you're doing is about being good, adding to the common good.